This is Ferdinand de Saussure, a person whose ideas helped transform the study of literature and culture in the 20th century through the school of thought or the approach to signs and symbols that came to be known as structuralism, and which generated the science of semiotics. I'm Dr. Newman. This is our lecture on structuralism in our series on lectures on the literary theory, and this is an apple. Wait a second. This is not an apple. This is a representation of an apple. This is, in fact, a representation of an apple, because these are a bunch of pixels of a photograph of an apple. And an apple can have a number of significations, right? The word apple and the icon, the image of an apple, this is a sort of more naturalistic representation of an apple. This is a more abstracted one, but we both look at them and think apple. And when we look at this and think apple, we realize that this is also part of a history of signs designating the electronics company Apple that have changed over time. Now, the study of symbols and representations is called semiotics, or sometimes semiology. But semiotics is the name that really struck. And we know that a representation of an apple, and the word apple, doesn't just represent the fruit or the computer company. It also has connotations, a word maybe you've learned in English class, associated with education, an apple for the teacher, with health or healthy eating, as depicted on this packaging here, and also with sin and temptation. The apple is what we call polysemous. It has a number of different meanings. And so we're going to look at how semiotics and structuralism gave us a vocabulary and a method of analysis for thinking about signs and significations. In this first video, we're going to talk about the origins and development of these ideas. And in the second video, we're going to talk about their transfer and their application to the study of human culture and literature. So this first video is going to focus on the works of this guy, Ferdinand de Saussure, a Swiss linguist, semiotician, and philosopher, one of the founders of 20th century linguistics, one of the founders of semiotics, a man who sported a pretty dope mustache, and a guy who died, unfortunately, young before he was able to publish his own works, but his students collected his notes and edited them and published them in 1916 as the course on general linguistics, where they would prove to have an influence on, among others, Roman Jakobson's See My Video and Russian formalism. So in the course on general linguistics, you will find this illustration, which is a diagram of the bilateral sign. This is an idea that de Saussure developed, the idea that every sign consists of a signifier, the word arbre or arbor, and the signified, the mental concept. And here he uses on the top the idea of the signifier, and on the bottom he uses the Latin word arbor to represent the idea of the mental concept, or vice versa maybe. But arbre is French and arbor is Latin. His ideas about language and signification revolved around a few big oppositions, a few big distinctions, which were important for the analysis of how language and other sign systems make meaning. One is the distinction between the sign, which is the combination of the concept and the physical artifact or word that signifies the concept, with the signified. Another distinction that's associated, and which we'll talk about in this first video, is the distinction between meaning and value. A second important distinction that he made, which would transform the study of language and culture in the 20th century, was the distinction between language and speech. And that may sound strange to you, but I promise I will explain it. He also distinguished between the study of the synchronic study of language, which is studying language as a system outside of time, and the diachronic study of language, which is looking at how language changes over time. So let's begin by looking at concept number 1, signs and signifiers. It's time to talk then about the bilateral sign. Every sign consists, as we discussed already, of a signifier and a signified. And the signifier can be a sound or an image, and the signified is we can think of as a mental concept. The signifier is a perceptible object. It might be an actual plant, a little bonsai tree, or you look outside your window and see a tree and think tree. It could be the word tree, in whatever form that may take, or it could be the image of a tree, like this little icon here. This is not an actual tree. This is a series of lines that recall the image of tree in our mind through resemblance. And this is the Latin word arbor, which means tree in Latin, as an arbor day or arborist. And this points to the fact that the connection between the signifier and the signified is arbitrary. The signified is the mental concept. It could be the actual plant, but it can also refer to an organizational scheme, like a family tree, or an organizational chart, or an evolutionary tree. The word tree can also evoke environmental values or a religious image, such as the tree of life in the Garden of Eden, or the Yggdrasil, the world tree of Norse mythology. Now, what do we mean when we say that the connection between signifier and signified is arbitrary? Well, what we mean is that there's no necessary connection. If you've noticed, the Latin term arbor has turned into the French arbre, but it still, for a French speaker, refers to tree, as does the Spanish audible. Now, all those three have a historical connection, right? But what if we just shift lanes here and bring in the German Baum? That also means tree, as does the Greek dendro, and the smosa, and the Welsh coeden, and the English word, of course, tree. There's no reason why any one of these should or shouldn't refer to the concept of a tree. There's no necessary connection between the sound or the image of these words and what they represent. The connection between signifier and signified has no logical motivation. It just exists, and this is why we call it arbitrary. Nobody invented it at any point either, and if they did, it was so long ago it doesn't matter. When we think about language and systems of meaning from a structuralist point of view, we sort of imagine all signs coming together at once in a kind of big bang because of the way that meaning works in the structure of language. Now, so we're going to talk now about the distinction between meaning and value. All three of these concepts here, we might say a deciduous tree, a conifer, and a palm tree, we can all refer to and think about in English under the sign of tree. Meaning refers to the relationship between the sign and the concept it represents. But if the signifier is arbitrary, the signified is also somewhat arbitrary as well, because if I say tree to you, do I know which one of these things you're going to think? No, but the meaning of tree is any and all of these at once, right? That's the meaning. So how do we distinguish? It helps to distinguish between meaning and value. Value depends on the position of a sign in a system or structure of signification. So the value of tree can vary depending on the context. Are you in Mexico? Are you in northern Canada? Are you in Virginia or Missouri? That may change the value that is called to you by the meaning of the sign tree. And so value is determined not by its connection to the signifier, but by its place in a whole web of different signs and concepts that all have a differential meaning. They're distinguished from each other by not being each other. And so this is one of the key ideas in structuralist thought and semiotics, is that signification is differential. A sign refers to its signifier. Signifier refers to its signified because it doesn't refer to other signifieds. A tree is not a shrub, and a tree and a shrub are both not plants. Okay, they are, but in a kind of botanical sense. But when I say tree, shrub, or plant, you're going to think about different things. So in a semiotic sense, they are different. Signification is differential. Everything means what it does by virtue of not meaning what something else means. This is one of the harder concepts to get your head around. But this is what the key issue here is that blue has a meaning that's different from purple or red and green, not because of any special characteristics of blue, but because it's not the other ones. So let's talk about what this means for language and develop our exploration of the concept of language versus speech and how we study language and speech, whether we look at it diachronically or synchronically. One of Saussure's basic distinctions was the distinction between langue and parole. Langue, or language, is language as it's understood as a structure, as a system, as a potential, as all the sentences that can be said, all the different possible words that can be expressed in a language, all the concepts that it develops. Langue is the internal system of the language. We can think of it as the grammar, the entire network of signs. Later on, linguists would use the term competence, as in what is a native speaker of a language capable of saying. To a certain extent, langue is idealized, right? It's idealized. It's kind of sanded and polished, and there's no rough edges, and there's no mistakes in it. It's a kind of a perfect, self-consistent structure. Parole, on the other hand, we sometimes can translate into English as discourse. And this is not in the abstract system of the language. This is specific acts of speech or utterances. It is the realization of the abstract structure of language in particular sentences, texts, conversations. We can distinguish it, and modern linguists distinguish between competence and performance, between what is supposedly the capabilities of a native speaker versus what they actually produce. And so parole is external and langue is internal. That is, it's internal to the language versus external, as this is where the language meets the world. And the world is both determinative and determined. It determines and is determined by the external and internal systems of language. The external world includes social forces and material reality, and which is both informed by and informs language. Language has to represent the external world, but the way that we perceive and understand the external world is framed by the language that we speak. And so this insight developed into what in the 20th century was sometimes called the linguistic turn. And this is something that was especially clutch in the social sciences, where the way that we look at human behavior, interaction, politics, culture, religion, literature, was all affected by the fact that we mediate our understanding of all those things and our relationships with each other through language. And so there was this intense focus on language and how it works. And one of the ways that was developed to study language, a new way in the 20th century that was crucial, was the development of the synchronic study as opposed to the diachronic study of language. Synchronic study refers to studying language at a specific moment in its history. There's a way in which you can think of it as like a still or a snapshot of language. And you're thinking about a language as it exists at a particular moment or really outside of time. What is the structure of the English language? Not as it's spoken in Missouri in 2023 or in Britain in 1888 or, you know, in Lower Saxony in 437, but what is just English as a structure, as an abstract structure, versus diachronic study, which studies language as it changes through time. Now, diachronic study was the typical way to study language in the 19th century among, for example, the philologists who we discussed early on in our lecture on why there is an English major in the study of English literature at the university. Synchronic study studies grammar as a formal, complete, and idealized system. Actual human speakers make mistakes, or they deliberately say things that are not consistent with prescribed formal grammar. Diachronic, actual speech, therefore, is subject to change, alteration, and variation. And diachronic study will study historical variation in grammar and vocabulary over time. Synchronic study studies the internal system, the langue. Diachronic study studies external behavior using language, parole, discourse. Synchronic study focuses on the capabilities of a perfect speaker, whereas diachronic study tends to focus on texts as the record of the language over time. Now, synchronic study, studying language synchronic study as an abstract system, helped produce a perspective on language and the organization of language that allowed linguists to focus on different aspects of language as differential systems of signs. At the core level, at the kind of molecular level of language, is phonetics, the acoustic phenomenon, such as the labial dental fricative. Yes, this is linguistic terminology. And what makes f different from v, different from b, and different from p? Well, all of these signify different things. Fat, vat, bat, right? And those make different meanings for different words, not, again, because of any a special connection between bat and a little thing that goes squeak, squeak, squeak and flies around, but because bat is not fat or vat or cat or anything else. And then so the words that are, or the sounds that are significant in a specific language or make significant differences in a specific language are called phonemes. And this is where the raw kind of material of the language is formed into a system of difference. All the 120 or 180 sounds that a human mouth can produce, each language has a different inventory of meaningful differences. And some, like French, has a r sound that we don't in English. English has a th sound that they don't in French. In English, the difference between th and the, as in thin and this, doesn't have a meaningful difference. If you say this, but you pronounce it this, you're just mispronouncing it. But in Arabic, th and the are different in meaning. They have a phonemic difference to them. And so the system of sound in every language is different. So that and that is something that a linguist will study synchronically. What is the system of sound in a language at a particular moment in time, abstracted from particular acts of use? Now, above the level of phoneme, if you put phonemes together, kind of zooming out from subatomic to atomic to molecular level, you get to morphology, which is chunks of sounds that come together to form minimal signifying elements in words, like, for example, the English morpheme ing, right, which you put at the end of drink to form drinking, or walk to form walking, which turns a verb into a noun or adjective. And then the system of all the words is called lexis or lexicon, and this is all the possible words in a language. And this kind of takes us almost to the top level of the internal system of language, which is syntax, which is how we put all of this together to form meaningful statements. And so a structural linguist, a synchronic linguist, will look at abstracted sentences to see how that language makes meaning. Now, external linguistics takes us, or sometimes it's called applied linguistics, which should tell you something. That takes us to the level of discourse, of parole, of language in use. And external linguistics studies discourse, but then this is where we can get into actual human activity, social organization, culture, myth, literature, society. I talk about such things as discursive practices, discursive formations, and mythologies. Apples have a meaning within. I can say, the man ate the apple, right? And I can parse that sentence using syntax and understand it on a literal level. But we can then take that apple and we can take these signs outside of internal system levels and into meaningful practices in society where we can understand what work Apple is doing as a signifier of a corporate entity, or what the word apple is doing, say, in the phrase Adam's apple, which is an anatomical term, right? And so you should say, okay, that's just a scientific objective thing, right? It's just a structure in the throat. But the Adam's apple is also a sign itself. It's something that we associate with gender. We tend to see the Adam's apple as being masculine or a sign of the male biological sex. Now, as gender has become increasingly an object of focus, attention, scrutiny, concern, so has this seemingly objective scientific thing called the Adam's apple, right? As a sign of difference. So what is the difference between a man and a woman? What are the distinguishing features? Well, for one, there's perhaps a number, but one is an Adam's apple. How much value do we attach to that? What is the meaning of that for us, right? And so the point I'm trying to make here is that thinking about semiotic systems as systems of significant differences that have an internal logic of their own, but one which has effects and causes in the external realm of human behavior, society, politics, culture, etc., is useful for thinking about literature and many other human practices. And that's where we're going to get to in the next video when we talk about Claude Levi-Strauss, the anthropologist, and how he took Ferdinand de Saussure's ideas and applied them to the study of anthropology and mythology, and then Roland Barthes, the literary critic who used Levi-Strauss's ideas to study contemporary French culture and sophisticated canonical literature. So join me for part 2 of structuralism. Bye!